Welcome to Microsoft Purview, Innovation and Accelerators and Securing Your Sensitive Information in SharePoint. That's quite a title, isn't it? With me is Maxime Bombardier. How did I do?
That was good.
All right, awesome. Who is Principal Product Manager on Purview, and he is our resident expert here today. And then, of course, you have me, Steve Thomas. I'm a Senior Product Manager. I focus primarily on MIP, information protection, and DLP workloads, data loss prevention. I'm also, of course, the stereotypical middle-aged guy with a ponytail and a Hawaiian shirt here to talk to you about data security. You know that. So we have some street cred here as well. And we're going to talk first about the Microsoft Purview journey. And there's going to be a good reason for that, because a lot of you, how many of you have heard of Microsoft Purview? Okay, how many of you have heard of Microsoft Purview, and that's about as far as you know? Exactly. So it's going to be important that we talk about the Microsoft Purview journey and you have a good understanding of all that is encompassed within Microsoft Purview, number one. And number two, what we're going to be focusing on not only today in this first session, but also in the second session. And most importantly, how much of Purview is relevant and important to one of the overall themes here, which is AI and the age of copilots as well. We're going to talk about information protection innovations and guardrails, which are going to be essential going forward in the age of AI. And then, Max is going to dive into a lot on our blueprints for accelerated information protection deployment. Because at the end of the day, yeah, this is all well and good, but how do I get going? How do I get this rolled out in my organization? How do I get in front of problems like analysis paralysis? How can I accelerate my deployments and get my data secure as we move rapidly into the age of AI and copilots? And then, of course, within that, safeguard your most sensitive documents with DLP and identify suspicious use of sensitive information with insider risk management. So Microsoft Purview is a fundamental piece of your overall security, whether you're implementing a zero trust model, because what we focus on within the world of Purview when it comes to data security is not only the external threats out there, but the internal problems, the human factor. I love this cartoon. I love starting out this cartoon. If you follow me on LinkedIn, I've posted this cartoon recently. But as you can see here, we have all the protections we possibly have in place in this corner with firewalls, antivirus, software, encryption, BitLocker, and then of course in the other corner we have Dave, who is actually a good person, but there's a lot for Dave to keep track of, and at the end of the day, it's a human error that we have to worry about. It's a human error that we have to watch. And one of the things that Purview helps you do is Purview helps you get not only in front of malicious use, but also the accidental use, the human problem. And because at the end of the day, I ask my customers when they're actually looking into purchasing Purview, what parts of Purview do I need to use? Well, first of all, do you trust humans in your org to do the right thing? If the answer is yes, well, there's this part of Purview. If the answer is no, well, there's this part of Purview. If the answer is I don't know, well, let's try everything here. So let's talk about the Purview family real quick. So Microsoft Purview, as we know it today, combines three main areas when it comes to your data. There's data security, which is the primarily focus here, which is securing your data across the lifecycle wherever it lives. Within Purview, we have DLP, data loss prevention, insider risk management, that intelligent part that actually takes all those signals and actually helps you get in front of insider risk and insider threats before they happen or as they are happening. And then, of course, the classic information protection platform, sensitivity labels, for example. And then, of course, we move into data governance, which a lot of this came from what was formerly known as Azure Purview. And that's where we get into more of your structured data, data map, data catalog, data estate insights. And then, of course, we have the compliance side of things. See, Purview is kind of what we used to call it Microsoft 365 compliance. And there was compliance there, but one of the reasons behind the rebranding is because the purview of Purview, see what I did there? Went far beyond compliance into the world of data security, into the world of data governance, data lifecycle management. But over on the compliance side, that's where we get into things like regulatory compliance management, e-discovery and audit, your discover and respond. We get into things like keeping communication compliance, and then of course records management, DLM. And what's great about the convergence of what was formerly known as Microsoft 365 Compliance, Azure Purview, is we're bringing all of this into the umbrella of this brand of Purview that, of course, that goes across your entire, not only Microsoft estate, but actually as we begin to expand across all of the other elements that might be in use, including other cloud providers as well. So, our most urgent data security challenges, first of all, is knowing what data we have, especially unstructured data. Sitting in the expert's booth, everyone comes up to me, and at least every other person says, we've got thousands of sites. We don't know what we have. And one of the greatest things about Microsoft Purview, and especially the information protection platform, is we can discover your sensitive data. We can actually give you a window into what type of sensitive data already exists in your organization, whether it's through Exchange, whether it's through OneDrive, whether it's through SharePoint. And then, of course, discovering your data, then securing the data, and then, of course, detecting how users are interacting with the data, and being able to determine what risk you have and how to get in front of those risks, especially in the world of data exfiltration. And then, of course, ensuring your data remains secure from data leakage and data exfiltration activities. When I travel around and meet with customers, I always like to ask them, what is keeping you up at night? And of course, it's regulatory fines, enterprise ransomware attacks, or we're in the news because of a huge data breach or data exfiltration. So this is the world we live in. And we also understand that at the end of the day, there's so much unstructured data in your estate that we need to rely on other types of AI, other types of machine learning, not just the nice and awesome, sexy generative AI, but the AI working in the background to actually be able to discover, auto-classify your data, be able to look at user intent, and based upon configurations and risk levels, be able to start creating policies and using adaptive protection and other intelligent technologies to provide both protection at the top with information protection, and then, of course, the counterparts to that, DLP, all the way to the endpoint, and then, of course, insider risk management. And again, this is expanding well beyond the world of Microsoft. We understand that it's not just Microsoft-oriented estates out there. You know, we reject the tyranny of war and embrace the genius of and with multi-cloud. So we have support for multi-cloud coming. At Fabricon, you heard we have support for the Fabric, hybrid, SaaS, and our partner ecosystems as well. We start with labeling. Sensitivity labels are the core of Microsoft's information protection platform. And sensitivity labels give you the capability of providing controls, providing even encryption if you need it. And this is as part of the file and its properties and its metadata itself. So you don't have to rely on things like archaic things like NTFS permissions or external controls, because the security travels with the entity, the document itself. And this can be applied not only just to content, but also to containers. And when we think of containers in the world of Microsoft 365, we're not just talking about folders, we're not just talking about sites, but we're also talking about Teams channels, Microsoft 365 groups, SharePoint sites as well. And with container labels, we get inheritance. So we don't have to do things so ridiculously granularly. And all of this stuff can be done either manually or can also be applied automatically through policy as well. But the sensitivity label is, at the end of the day, the core of information protection. And information protection is, Max and I argue, I say 90% of the battle, Max says 99%, but too often people rely on DLP as the ultimate gate. And the ultimate gate is information protection. DLP is your actual stopgap. So again, if you don't trust your users to always do the right thing, put a label on it. Start that evangelizing that within your organization. Put a label on it. Now, the unification of Purview started with, of course, the brand. A couple of years ago, you heard the announcement about Microsoft Purview, bringing together the world of Microsoft 365 compliance products, data security products, and Azure Purview under one umbrella. And it was not just for the purposes of unifying those two products, but it was to create a product that would start with the workload of Microsoft 365 and Azure in terms of protections, protecting through a combination of several controls, not only just labeling, but things like dynamic watermarking, conditional access, automatic label with inheritance, just-in-time protection that you see now even with things like endpoint DLP, but also going into data types beyond files, meetings, and unstructured data, but also including your structured data, Power BI, Synapse, Cosmos DB, Power Apps, but then we start looking at the workloads going beyond just Azure and Microsoft 365, going into your Fabric and not just Microsoft oriented. We're now moving into AWS and S3 as well. The idea at the end of the day is to dispel the myth that Microsoft just protects Microsoft stuff. Microsoft is no longer about just protecting Microsoft stuff. And this, again, is built on a huge classification engine that has been refined over time. This classification engine is the core of Microsoft's information protection platform, which all of these additional products can plug into and leverage. And these I'm not going to drain this entire slide because there's a lot to talk about here, but we go beyond just scanning text for patterns and regexes. We go into things like named entities, OCR, trainable classifiers. Trainable classifiers is great because you can even customize that. You can train our AI to know what your proprietary data looks like. That gets around the chicken and egg scenario of, well, how does Microsoft know what to protect if only we know what this information is? Well, through trainable classifiers, you train our AI to know what that is. We're constantly refining, we're constantly expanding the capabilities, and of course, there's a lot more innovation coming, especially in the area of OCR, and giving you capabilities of leveraging that in a pay-as-you-go fashion as well, and the tools to calculate the usage of that. And for the sake of time, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to turn this over to my partner in crime, Maxine, to talk a little bit more about data estate protection.
He's got a radio voice. I don't. Thank you. I think one of the key things, can you hear me well, by the way? It's all good? Okay. I'll try not to move my head. I'm not good at that. So one of the key things on the previous slide about classification is this, if you're not aware, this is already happening for everything you got in M365. If any of you have access to Content Explorer, you want to know what has credit card numbers, what has SSN, it's already classified. So that classification is super important. It's already there, and we've extended that through the data map with the merging of Azure Purview, now available in one place. So that's one of the key pieces on that classification, super important. It's already there. So now it's all about the policies that you put in place to start protecting that information automatically. As we moved, and quickly on that's kind of a bit of a refresh on some of the state stuff we talked about. The expansion, so I'm going to talk about the expansion and then we'll go back on how do we start implementing this. That expansion that we've been doing across the entire data estate, as we talk about that merging of Azure Purview and M365 compliance, the reason for that is also for us to give you one way of managing. If we're doing audits, it's one place. We're doing roles and responsibility. It's one place. It's all data. Whether the data is on Azure, AWS, or M365, it's all the same thing for you as a data security admin to apply policies across, but also for data curators to be able to look at what's sensitive for the entire data estate. So very important notion here is that, think of it as Purview, Microsoft Purview, as an approach to everything we do. There are core scenarios that are different for data security versus privacy versus compliance and data governance, but the approach is in one place. It is already available. If you haven't noticed, there's the new portal has been public preview as of FabricConf, so about a month ago. If you go to purview.microsoft.com, you have access, of course, you'll be able to see that merging together. So that portal, we'll talk more through up to Ignite as to what's the time frame for GA and deprecation of compliance. Everything is moving to Purview portal. So super important aspect here. That bridge of bringing in both unstructured and structured data gives you that single lens of throughout, but also gives us, by unifying, a way to go from any of these data sources, whether it's AWS, whether it's SQL, Cosmos DB, and you have sensitivity, you can then attach that sensitivity on, going up all the way to the user. So if it's surfaced by Fabric or if it's surfaced by Power BI, that highly sensitive SQL column, the sensitivity label will flow through Power BI and it will become highly sensitive automatically. So that small nuance here is you're coming in from a protection at the server level in SQL, bridging all the way through to the end user with Power BI. So very powerful message on the sensitivity label. That's why the 99 versus 90% maybe might come from. Really, really important in context of, yes, the title was super big and a lot of buzzwords. I think I missed Copilot in there, sorry. But as we look at accelerating, the reason for this is to make sure you're using the right information before it's surfaced by Copilot. So, couple quick pointers on just the multi-cloud journey. I'll expand in this afternoon's session on some of the scenario. I'll show some demos, or at least slide demos of what that experience is as it flows through and what it means. But we've added capability on protection policies for ADLS storage. We have blob storage, AWS S3, so those are the file components. We have SQL Server at the column level, so detecting sensitivity on that column, apply ABAC or access control on those columns and files. Think of Purview as the data component. I'm going at each file, I'm going at each SQL column, versus Defender Story, which is about the container level security. So layered security approach. And the other piece is about insider risk, being able to capture events from non-M365. So insider risk, also, what I'd like to say is, I'm here for helping you deploy. The challenge with insider risk is the name. A lot of, there's like mental block often, it's like an insider question. Yes, but every stolen credential becomes an insider risk at that point. So insider risk is really that glue. When we think of that triangle of MIP, so information protection, data loss prevention, and insider risk management, that acronym, IRA, I know we had another one. So when we think of that triangle, it's really one product. And that's a huge shift. I have many organizations that I work with, 3 different teams, don't necessarily talk to each other, have different policies and mindset. It really is thought as one. And so bridging in this context, adding signals from Box and Dropbox and AWS into insider risk to understand how your users are leveraging that information. Are they changing the sensitivity label? Are they trying to rename them to obfuscate, archiving, exfiltrating, and basing your DLP policies on the user risk instead of just regular traditional DLP. There's another one for the pictures. Similar slide than before, just on showing that shared platform across the board. Again, Microsoft Purview, think of it as a one-shop stop, multiple different audiences in there. So do manage your permissions, roles and permissions correctly just to see, they should see what they should. But it is one place to go that will span across. All right, so now it's really about, and this is more of almost a chat, although it's a big room to have a chat. All the question almost that we got as the expert so far, and we'll be there throughout the day as well, has been about, okay, how do I take this? And some of you have seen this overloaded slide, I'm not gonna read it. But this is the core of Microsoft Information Protection. You might have seen different versions over the years of this, but it shows everything we thought of compliance and now Purview, the core, the heart has always been information protection. One of the key challenges I've seen with customers, especially in the document management space, records management, is the nuance between terminology. Classification, always present. Like I said, every email, every document that goes in SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, emails that are coming in from Exchange Online, always classified. Classification is just a way to know I have these sensitive information in these documents, emails. Labeling is what you're doing with that information. Or labeling is an organizational tag, that's it. So for those of you that configure, it's like, yeah, Max, there's a bit more to it. Yes, you can auto-label, I'll talk about that process. But at the end of the day, a label is something that should mean something to the end user. Don't overthink labels. You'll hear, those of you that might have joined the How Microsoft Does IT session, they'll talk about the 5x5 rule. You should never see more than 5 labels at a time. Those are the concepts that comes into play. So I'll expand a little bit on what we do and how to think of that. But as you can see, the heart of this is really for us to expand the capability of classification. That's when we talk about trainable classifiers. We talk about fingerprint. We're going to talk about EDM or exact data match. Those are there to help you reduce false positives. But we keep building on that engine. OCR was a great example that you added there. OCR is what? It's a text extraction tool of image. That's what it is. So in the whole pipeline of understanding what is sensitive, OCR is just added, and then you can choose what workload you want to support OCR for. So as we keep building this as the back end, you're going to be the first audience to see this. I'm totally testing this. I'm working on having a blueprint as one slide. I got two. As one slide to help you navigate, depending on where that conversation is coming from. There's not a single way to answer this question. You can't wait for the picture. I have 4 stages. It'll work out. The reason for this is if I'm talking to a DLP, pro DLP audience or pro MIP audience or pro IRM audience, every time it changes the angle. If you've been doing some labeling, different angle. My objective, or my mission, should I choose to accept it? It's too late, I've already accepted it. I got it, like today, MIP deployment can take 18, 24 plus months. How many of you have deployed sensitivity label, just out of curiosity? Okay. Okay, so roughly about a third-ish of the room. All right, good. Let's see if that was good. And it probably took a while. It's rare that I see a case where they just deployed. And then and I've been on both sides. I've been in consulting. I'm in engineering now. Engineering is going to say, well, Max, we have default labels. Why aren't they using it? Well, are they correct? Are they right? Are they already deployed? Can they use it as is? I see that's a reaction over here. So that, yeah, but how do we get to understanding those labels? Do they make sense to every organization? Are they comfortable with it or modifying them before publishing? So, as the first stage of this whole approach, I'm working out, and just to explain more on the blueprint, my intent is to have sort of this high level first for those of you familiar with EBCs or executive briefing. If someone's looking for, hey, what do I need to know to go deploy data security with Purview, that's the starting point. I'll have the level 200 version of that, and I'll have the articles that I need to write for each of these stages. That we'll talk in this first phase about don't paralyze by analysis. One of the longest thing to do with deploying labels is figuring out the names. It's been a journey at Microsoft, to be fair. We've done a lot of those mistakes. I've probably done all of them. And actually, that's kind of the message. It's okay to not be right. Start now. Because anytime I get a conversation about information protection that lasts for months, well, if we had started with something 6 months ago, all of that information from the past 6 months would have been protected by now. So there's no better time to start and write right now. We can go quick, and it's okay to sort of fail fast. I'm not going to say you're going to fail, but it's okay to reiterate on each of these components that we're going to talk here. So choosing the right default labeling, we have some recommended ones. In the article I'm going to write, we'll talk about the pitfalls. So for example, at Microsoft, we had a low, medium, high business impact. Nobody understood the difference. I mean, we got the word. It's like, I don't know if what I'm doing is medium impact or high business impact. I don't know. So it's got to tell something to the user. If you were to look at our, and it's documented.
Even worse, we used acronyms. So it was MBI, HBI, which just confused things further.
Yeah. Microsoft, we got 5 labels. It is non-business. We had the whole personal debate at some point, so that got renamed to non-business. We got public, we got general, and then we got confidential and highly confidential. That's it. That's all it usually needs in most organizations. Stay away from concepts of having a sensitive, like credit card label. Don't make it too specific. It's got to be relevant to the user. Because all the label is about is that organizational tag. It's a vehicle to bring protection automatically. So I call this stage more about the intelligent defaults, because that's one of the mantra we've started pushing at Microsoft as well, is you got to not rely on Dave, I think was his name, in the corner. To not rely on Dave, you got to make it so that whenever they go to a SharePoint site, it's already kind of almost done for them. Now, the first step to that intelligent default is container labels. If you don't have container labels right now, start. Come see us, ask us a question, look at the blueprint. The reason for that is that container label, there are some features now, there are some features coming up. I'll talk briefly what I can of what's coming up. But at the same time, there's also a lot of partner community right here to help you bridge that gap in a moment. But container labels is one, it's a access control based label in SharePoint. So you can say private, public, group. You can say, do you allow guest sharing? You can set up conditional access for managed devices. But it's an anchor. It's an anchor that we'll leverage in the future to say, well, what about my files? Can I auto-label my files as well in that container? And that's something, that's a direction where we're heading. When we think about one of the features that was released last year called Default Library Label in SharePoint, that's a manual setting for today. But that default labeling is that second level anchor to say everything that goes in that SharePoint library inherits the file label. That's where you can have encryption. So default labeling at different layers, but that container label is super important. And one of the key changes I'd say that I would recommend highly is a lot of the sites, part of our fault, I agree, but when we release SharePoint Online, hey, go public sites, it's cool. You can collaborate together, it's easy to discover. And, well, do that less now. But we also have extended, for all of you, you've known probably about shareable links, and that's the last item at the bottom. I'll cover the other two. But the shareable link is sort of that gap to say, instead of doing public sites, do them private, allow companies shareable links. The big nuance here is you can collaborate just as much as before. You can share just as much as before within the company, but it's not done by default. If you want to restrict what Copilot sees, what Enterprise Search sees, you all know, and Jeff mentioned it on the keynote, like it's only what the user sees. The problem is the user sees too much or has access too much today. Fastest thing you can do, make your site private, move to company shareable links. Of course, train your users, but that's the fastest thing you can do to start protecting your estate to the data level. Super important point. It's very small nuance here, but still allowing collaboration. And in the Microsoft Does IT, it actually has the table of what we recommend as a starting point. That'll be part of the articles that we'll write as well on all of the labels that I mentioned for container labels and file label, what type of automatic protection we have. So in the case of container labels, we have internal plus NDA external, so guest sharing is allowed, and we have confidential. All of those are private. The only one that allows public, but defaults to private, is general. So very important nuance here is just sort of changing your defaults so that you're more protected automatically. Now the other two quick things on that blueprint, change management, sounds silly, needed, always forgotten. We'll have some templates that you can reuse or not. Just how to communicate. It should be about where's the buttons, how do I change my labels. You can train them. So I'll give you an example on file labeling that we have in confidential. It's all employees with vendors, because we do have a lot of Microsoft, and we have any unprotected. And we have recipients only, sorry, we've got 4. Recipients only should be, again, the label's got to tell something. It's easy. I know it's all employees, it's vendors, and it's recipients only. The any unprotected is interesting. I recommend this one. if only because you need a way out for users to not have to call support every time it doesn't work for a business process you didn't think of. It's going to happen. And that's where that paralysis by analysis comes into play. Whenever you start with encryption, whenever you are at the encryption level, you will get users that calls in, it's like, hey, it encrypted something, whatever the reason, right? So we'll talk about auto-labeling, but whatever the reason, that any unprotected is a way out. But it's an anchor for you to do different DLP on them. It's an anchor for you to do different insider risk management policies. So look, hey, hold on, Max is changing 1,000 files right now of confidential to unprotected. And then that's when I talked about the triggers. I'm renaming, I'm exfiltrating them. So you can have that anchor, super important, but it's a good way out for users. Train them on using it. All right, third point over there is just, there's a number of things on a tenant that are not started by default. These are newer things. I've been there for a while. But they're just options. Turning on trainable classifier, turning on like advanced classification. So there's a couple settings. PDF is not turned on by default. All of the things that we've added that adds processing over the years, all of these are included, no cost. With one exception that's not written, OCR. That can be turned on in specific workflows. So you can start OCR just for a mailbox if you would like to test it out. All right. As I move on to stage 2, this is more about the contextual information that you start protecting automatically. And what's going to be interesting here is part of that default labeling that I talked about, so go with your container labels, but the contextual conditions can be other things. You can start client-side and server-side auto-labeling, I'll cover that, but based on things that you know, file size, file extension, so the things that you are sure that you're not going to spend too much time knowing if it's truly a credit card number or not. So that's the other pitfall. Many customers start with sensitive information first, and then they try to figure out, oh, I got a false positive here. How do I do this? Right. Don't start with sensitive information. It's important, but start with the other ones first. Start protecting stuff right now. Like that's sort of my key message here. We have things we can do super quick. Start with the known conditions. So default labeling, so the stage 2 and 4, what you're gonna see as a nuance here is don't have to start with all automatism. Don't have everything automatic yet. But you can start with, okay, these are the priorities SharePoint side I want to target. Just put default library there. Put the default library label on it. Every new file or updated file will start getting labels. Start small, it's okay. Start something. Credential is one that I highly recommend turning it on. So if you didn't know, we have a sensitive info type for credentials. Super important. There is a risk, like any automatic classification, to have some false positive, but the credential one is like what I would put in a high confidence level of it contains credentials. Super important. That's the one that's going to say this file contains a token for Azure AD, contains a password for something. Very, very important to identify, and I would categorize that super quickly in highly confidential category. So quick example here. The other question I'm going to get is client-side versus service-side. Client-side is an opportunity for the user to change the label. And I'm kind of letting that sit. Because the importance here is the user sees that change happening. So if you take any sensitive info type, SSN, PCI information, you can use templates too, GDPR for example, which looks at dozens of different types of sensitivity. Client-side is that lower threshold, but you give the user an opportunity to change it because they see it. Don't overthink it, if it's capturing it or not. The point is, again, start securing more. And the second piece on service side, that's to go back on your existing SharePoint and OneDrives. Do you have it labeled over the years or decades? And to go back. Now, one of the questions is going to come up, Max, there's a 25,000 limit on the service side. I know. Well, that limit is going to go up 4 times. So it's going to be at 100,000. It's just about released now. But the point of the battle never was the maximum per data you can service side. It should always have been start with the default labeling, start with the client-side labeling first to capture that gap from now on, and leverage service-side auto-labeling, typically with higher threshold, to go back with the existing information. Super key here. Many customers start with service-side. Cool. Also do the other piece in parallel. All right. So stage 3 is sort of that evolution to the sensitive info type, more on knowing your information. So start exploring more in Content Explorer, or called Data Explorer now. Take a look at the suggestion. So use suggested labeling to the user, so again, they can change it, they can take the action. You start bringing more of that nuance of, we think this is confidential, protect it. Use simulation for auto-labeling. So if you haven't leveraged server-side auto-labeling, we released last year a great capability for simulation. Gives you a full report of what it's going to label beforehand, before you turn it on. So use simulation, super great capability over there. Start looking into those advanced classifiers to reduce the false positive. EDM's a big one. Exact data match, if you have not used this, this is all about your data. I'll take the credit card example here for financial institution. You can know, sure, a pattern of a credit card, it passes launch check, it's validated as what we think is a credit card. But you want to know, is it a credit card of one of my customer? And then you can have that database of 100 million rows, I think. You can have that database of Max, like it has my name, has my date of birth, has my credit card number, I know it's Max's credit card number. So again, reducing false positive, you know it's that information, it's yours, then you would highly protect it. So EDM, very, very important in today's world. Great to bridge that gap for false classification. And as we move on to the last stage, a little bit more on going back to the older data. So start implementing maybe some more automatism. Might have some custom code depending on what you've done to your existing SharePoint. If you've changed permission manually everywhere in SharePoint, I'm looking at you, I know some of you did. You might have used some provisioning tool that was changing permission. This is when you start thinking of retrofitting what you have that is not correct. Super stressing on start fresh from what you can. You can do this in days. And don't be afraid to start within days, okay, maybe weeks, but don't be afraid because you can rename label. You can start without encryption and add it a couple of months later, that's okay. The big point here is to start fresh on these items and then slowly incorporate the older data back to protect it. Your most important information in a way to secure is always the most recent one. The old one's super important too, just less over time. All right, I wanted to give you sort of a nuanced approach, like what's the outcome? If I do this per stages, what's the outcome I have for each of them? I'll expand the slide here, and I expand some potential protection policies you can start adding to it. So I've talked about a lot of these, but you're starting to limit oversharing, like for new and updated content. That's my focus that I'm trying to sell today. Users get familiarized with labels. That's okay. Policy recommended, so one of the switch I'd said, you're going to turn on some analytics. We're going to recommend you DLP policies. Like, hey, there's a lot of this type of sensitive information being shared. Are you okay with this? Click here to create a DLP policy. You can tweak it, don't worry. I would also recommend to start turning on DLP for labeled content. If you're not okay to share highly sensitive, highly confidential information, put DLP on it. So at least for anything that started to be labeled, you have that DLP for labeled content. And then I move on to the other one. So yes, you have your contextual. So I talked about all of this, but I put the turn on DLP for unlabeled content in stage 2, 3-ish, if I had an overlap here. Why? It's like, well, that's a good stopgap at that point is I have enough maturity on labeling content, and I want to do the stopgap for anything that's unlabeled. Maybe the user can contribute. How? Unlabeled content DLP. You want to share it? You got to label it. So training the user, again, just to make the right decision, putting them in the right SharePoint site, I might update the file, and then it'll pick up the label. Adaptive protection, super important. That's the piece I said about risk management of the user behavior. What this does is it's the same DLP policy that will trigger differently based on the user risk score. Max is a low risk right now. You can share. I might audit it. Max is starting to do some stuff that's weird. It's like I've changed labels. I'm going to block you with override. And then if I started exfiltrating stuff, I'm going to block you. So same policy, different behavior based on risk. Adaptive protection, key. It's configured. It's a mix between insider risk and DLP, for those of you that have not looked at it. And as you move forward, it's, when are you confident that you can do Copilot based on the information being secured for you? One quick last point was about protect beyond SharePoint. So I talked about multi-cloud earlier. Good thing to start in parallel if you have different teams, great. But as a labeling strategy, if I have to focus on first key pieces for Copilot, I'll push out a multi-cloud until then. This is, by the way, in public preview, everything I talked about earlier for protecting SQL, ADLS, and S3. That's already in public preview. We'll be releasing out later this summer, fall. And yeah, and the last item at the bottom right, start considering which applications should leverage MIP SDK to make them aware of MIP. So as you start encrypting, the typical challenge is I have business process. Now, option one is you just label without encryption. It's an option. Option two, you start leveraging the MIP SDK. I see that a lot in financial sector, especially, in two fashions. So some of them literally integrated the MIP SDK in the apps. Some of the ones, especially for legacy system, they put this kind of gateway app that can communicate with those servers to download files. And that gateway is the one that leverages MIP SDK before the file is given to the user. So rich capability there for leveraging all the labeling that we discussed, the protection, the insider, the information rights management part with the SDK. So, sort of the go-dos here that I want to have a couple key points, and there's a nuance of that slide with how Microsoft does IT, reduce oversharing. And that's, if anything today you remember from this session, one sentence, reduce oversharing. Use better defaults to do that. You can leverage the container, you should leverage the container labels, removing everyone except external from people picker. That's the concept of using the company shareable link instead. Restrict. Instead of just pick people, don't pick company-wide security group. Change it, changing your default behaviors. There's a lot of controls in both the SharePoint admins and Purview to help you do this. Labeling is that sort of gateway to bridge the gap. Talked about default labeling, I think we're good. Take a look at the SharePoint Advanced Management. If you haven't looked at a session this week, take a look at this session for SharePoint Advanced Management. They have some data governance or SharePoint site governance aspect to this, as well as reporting for oversharing. There's, and I mentioned everything about the existing data, so that's just worthy of, in one slide of everything we talked so far. But the last piece I want to cover is the lifecycle management, where do require 2 site owners for SharePoint sites. Implement what you need, whether it's with a third party or take a look at SharePoint Advanced Management to do that. Do a certification of site. So I had a question this morning about, hey, what do we do to go in and check all of our sites to go and re-secure? Do the other way around. If you don't know who your owners are, screen test. This site's going to get deleted and you can choose. But this site will get archived, deleted in X time. Don't try to be the admin that Dave that tries to figure out every owners of your 30,000 SharePoint sites. If you don't have that today, don't. Again, paralysis by analysis. You're trying to do everything. Delegate to users. You're going to get 3 situations. You're going to get a user that's going to click on this like, I'm the owner. That's fine. Good to go. Great.
Your Voltaire-ish comment is probably the best. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you're going to get that use case. That's great. You're going to get some users who will just let it go, because nobody says, I don't want this site. They just let it go, and then it gets deleted after some amount of time. And you'll get some of that they just didn't think that they should click on the button anyway. So yes, do plan ahead of time of what's that process, but there's no really other good way of doing this at scale with how many sites you got. And I know it's scary, but a lot more in data security is, what's the flip side of this is you're not protected. So it's that balance that's super hard to strike. Do you have the site ownership? Very, very important notion in SharePoint to have, as you all know. And the whole site certification and I was going to say useless, but unused sites in SharePoint, also available in SAM. So, and that's where I came with my 1% with DLP. DLP is there to catch the exception. Most of my job, customers are looking at DLP 300% of the time. Not saying DLP is bad, DLP is good. DLP is a parameter fencing. It's a whack-a-mole because there is always different vectors. I'm looking at this from endpoint, okay, but this browser, okay, but it's in private mode. Like you never finish at this whack-a-mole. They're all important. We got to get there. We got to do this.
I call it the last mile, but too often people use it as the first mile for defense.
Yeah.
DLP.
So very important to have. Not saying don't do DLP, do DLP. But if you're only doing DLP, you're missing a lot of things. Now, we can debate on the percentage. It's okay. It's meant to be a shock statement here. But the point with information protection, and through all that we've talked so far, you've labeled stuff. What is confidential, highly confidential, should get encrypted. Even if that information gets out, it's only usable by the users that have access. It's all employees. It's whatever you set it up to. So very key here on that nuance on DLP is good. Start using DLP on conditions like it's been for label and unlabeled file, sure. Don't use just sits either. That's also the other thing. Everybody's looking at DLP for credit card and PCI and SSN and all that. Yeah, use it on label and unlabeled. Super good key point. Very easy to look at. I've not been able to scan it. It's an archive file. Like there are very specific conditions that you can set in DLP to help you get started super quick on catching that exception, but really flipping a little bit of the mind on information protection first. Remember the overloaded slide with a bunch of icons that we had earlier? Sort of why we always said MIP is the heart, and DLP is the extension, IRM is the extension to see signals. That's why. All right. So now is the interesting part of a single slide to talk about innovation. And I'm going to tell you to join the community program, but I'll talk through some things. The reason is that community program exists for both security, I think there's 5, security and data security. So we have 3 in data security, we have privacy, we have like everything audit, e-discovery, and we have pure data security with MIP, DLP, IRM. Join any of these. This is how you can then stay informed on previews, participate in previews, share feedback in previews. Hot tip, this is the best time to get what you need as best as we can within the time frame we got, is within those private previews. For us to change things in private previews, super quick. Public preview, depends. GA, there's a heck of a process at that point. So very key if you want to stay informed and leverage these things, influence these things, stay informed with a CCP. Think just right now in MIP, DLP, IRM, we're running roughly through 35 previews. In MultiCloud, I'm running 14. There's a lot going on in Purview. And those are just some of the products within Purview, as you know. There's a lot going on. But I can talk about some directions of where we're heading or what we're thinking about doing. So I mentioned, how do we help you set the right default on container labels to file? So that's something we're looking at doing. How do we help bridge that gap? How do we retrofit? So those are the concepts. We want to get to the default label way, way, way quicker. We have, so I talked about the auto labeling limit from 25 to 100K. So we're expanding that limit from a service side standpoint. Another key point that we're doing in sensitivity label. I don't know, any of you using both parents and child labels? I'm going to look at 3 hands probably. Okay, good. If you are using parents label to label, we're going to put guardrails in place to ensure you're not. It's kind of breaking the system. But a key point is if you have confidential and you have sub-labels underneath, labeling should only be with the sub-labels, never with the... Some of you found some cool ways to use scripting to figure out a way to go around this, so we're putting guardrails. Important for those of you that have done it, but we'll have a migration process to help you move that out. So a couple things, those are coming up soon. You might have noticed, so dynamic watermarking is another quick topic that we have heavily requested for roughly 7 years, I think. We finally got to it. We are working on dynamic watermarking. You've seen some of that for Teams for the meeting itself, but we're talking here on the Office and PDF files. How can we do dynamic watermarking? You know, it's Max that's opening the file kind of situation here. So that's another key point coming up on the protection scheme of labels. What else can I talk about? Talk about that journey of Purview, and I with MultiCloud, I talked for Power BI, bridging from SQL to Power BI, and up to the user being protected. We're looking at this as well from, okay, what direction can we do for Teams? Teams super key here, but in Teams you have the pre-meeting, you have the during the meeting, you have post-meeting. You're going to have attachment. It might be in a meeting invite or not. You're going to have the chat. You're going to have the transcript. You're going to have the Copilot summary. How can all of that flow through with the same labeling scheme? So that's also something that we're working on. As you probably know, but if you don't, that's okay. You can label a meeting today with think of it as protecting the meeting invite. And then Teams Premium piggybacks on that with, okay, I'm going to protect in meeting as well. Now I want to flow through for the rest of all the artifacts that comes out of that meeting. So strong concept here, always about labeling. You can see why it's very important to start now on label. So super key with Teams. All right, so we saw a slide earlier about expanded workloads, thinking about loop, stream, to be able to label. So those are also elements that we're heading towards.
That Office team just keeps making products. We have to play catch up.
One of the other ones, so if I switch gear on what's coming up more from closer to SharePoint, one of which was announced recently. So SharePoint Restricted Search, which I did not talk about yet. So I'll talk about it now. So that's public preview, I believe now, if it's not just GA'd. The SharePoint Restricted Search, it's kind of two things. I would call it the hammer approach of saying, my estate right now is a mess. It's way over permission, but I want to test Copilot and I want to restrict it to this. And for all of you that came to ask me as the expert, I said, it's funny. We had this conversation in 2015 when we introduced Delve with Enterprise Search. Everybody was panicking. It's like, oh my God, they can see everything. It's the same thing with Copilot. It's just way better at it, but it was the same conversation. Literally in EBCs right now, it's the same conversation that I'm getting, but we have now SharePoint Restricted Search that can say, okay, well, we can shut it down. We can, it's still indexing, but we're blocking it off to say, we're not returning results. That's going to kill both Copilot and Enterprise Search, by the way. Super important. But the pieces here is it allows you to start going in Copilot, trial it out, see if it works for you, do you like it, where you get benefit, and giving you time to implement everything else I told you about. So that's a cool way to start. Of course, you're restricting search, so do expect the caveat of restricting search. It's all in hand-hand. Enterprise Search and Copilot are together.
If I may, are you doing that via a label or via the SharePoint don't index site?
Yeah, so the question is, do we do this via label or via SharePoint site? SharePoint, so it's a SharePoint configuration component. So everything else I talked about, just a second, everything else I talked about still relevant. This is more, that's why I said it's a bit of the hammer approach, it's like, oh my God, I want to start Copilot right now, but I got this mess. Okay, restrict my mess to this site or these sites, start Copilot, plan the rest of everything else I talked about. I'll give you that time to do it. Sorry, hold on.
Why don't we have access recertification in SharePoint?
Why don't we have access recertification in SharePoint?
To recertification, you mean for sites?
Yeah, we are talking so much about oversharing.
Yeah.
But the easy answer would be to recertify the access, where the owner can actually certify who would continue to have the access.
Oh.
So the owner is actually going to be the owner of the container.
So are you talking more from an access review? So the question was, how do we recertify access? Right. Good question. Don't quite have the answer. Come to me after, well, I'll take your name just to make sure I have the right answer. There is an access review component in Entra ID, but that's a bit separate, I think, of what you're asking now. I think, if I understand correctly, you would like to know for that site whether you should still have access. Is that correct?
So my problem with SharePoint is it gives you so much convenience to share something with the rest of the users, but the governance itself is inadequate, is what I think.
Right.
Because you actually share at the file level, at the folder level, and at the site level.
Yep.
And none of these things actually has a review option. Meaning, you have a review option
Yeah.
for guest users, but yeah.
Yeah, guest user we do. Yeah, I don't want to talk licensing. I'm going to go back and hide upstairs now. Please show your credential. I want to validate a couple things to fully answer. So it's a good question about recertification and how you would go at it. And what I do foresee is the challenge of setting up how do you do that and for what purpose and for which site. So there will be management challenges in doing this too, right? So, but it's a good question on how could we do it? How do we do this? Part of that could be with access review and making sure you're creating the right security groups and you attach it to the access review concept. So that might be the answer in this case. But a good question. And there was also a hand that was just up before, sorry. I'm trying to keep track, sorry. Yes?
So we have a fourth level, strictly confidential.
Yes.
Let's say you have a bad actor from a country that buys from Russia.
Yeah.
They want to go and see your data. Are you just painting a target on some of your data if you maybe are too specific?
Is this a conditional access type question answered you would like, or?
No,
okay. Shoot, I had an answer.
Pros and cons to this, but aren't you kind of saying that all of the public and internal confidential? You don't want to look at that.
So that's a good question. It's kind of talking philosophical planning. So maybe it's not always a good idea to put a label called super secret top.
Yeah.
Classified nuclear, you don't almost want to give away what it is in the labeling. Well, the good news is you can control the label taxonomy, you can control the naming, but I get what you're saying. It would make it easier for a bad actor, once they get inside and infiltrate, to actually then query the label. So,
and I agree, you might have, I'm very transparent. You might have seen me wince when I said strictly restricted. It's confusing to users unless they really understand it. But we try to keep it, for example, we had challenges in the past, confidential and restricted. I'm like, okay, well, I don't understand the difference. But anyway, beyond that terminology point, and you can rename those, I think the important piece is are you attaching encryption with it?
Not yet, but for us it's fairly broad, but it's mostly research and development and mergers and acquisition.
Yeah.
As that label. So,
Strongly advise having strictly confidential, or whatever the term is, strictly restricted, like the highly confidential stuff should have encryption, which alleviates that issue that you talked about. It's like, well, they know it doesn't matter, they can't open it because it's encrypted. So there's a bit of that aspect coming into play. And conditional access is one of the things we're looking at doing too, so being able to say for strictly confidential, I'm all messed up in terms. But for that label, I don't want to allow these regions, countries, et cetera. So,
how many of you are still having trouble getting buy-in for information protection from stakeholders and leadership? Wow, and see, that's really surprised me. Have you shown them Content Explorer in your org? Because you can't, there's no plausible deniability after that. Once they see Content Explorer, it's...
Yeah. And now there's a new Data Explorer that'll give you that plus Azure and AWS. So yeah, you can get concerned. I think it was, you got track?
So for an organization full of Daves, is there...
It's a big corner.
Is there a good way to drive adoption or teaching them how to use labels versus just turning on labels? If you're in an organization that doesn't have a good training department,
Yeah.
IT turns a feature on and just expects the users to figure it out. Is there a good adoption plan for teaching labeling?
Yes. Yeah.
We're working on that. You're
transparent.
starting to see with the various products of like through Priva and through DLP policy, tips coming up, kind of in the moment training. We're gradually implementing that. Yep.
And I know we're at time, so I'll answer the question. I'll wrap up. Yes, there are more questions. I'll remain in front for any other questions. We'll also be at As the Expert, probably except lunch in our next session at 4. At 4, we'll expand on a little bit more on multi-cloud, and we'll talk about Purview for AI. We'll give you a different vector of how you protect what for AI, because when I think of protection, talk today was mostly about protecting your information for use in Copilot, making sure you're seeing the right thing. But you got to protect yours for if you're using a different LLM, if people are testing, BART or something else. And also there's a third vector, by the way, not talked during this, but your use of AI with Azure OpenAI type solution and how your data is leveraged within that. That falls more in the realm of security for AI, but that's something you can come and ask the experts. We can chat a little bit further. Well, anyway, I'll close, but I'll continue on the questions if you're okay for that. But thank you very much for your time. I know we're at time, so.